how they have, when first published, today they continue to resonate, which is says an awful lot about their work itself, and I think you'll appreciate when you hear them what it actually meant. Now the subject for this evening, of course, is the censorship, and it is a perpetual wonder when you read the book how on earth it escaped the wrath of the censor, because it is totally anti-authoritarian. It is totally anti the status quo. And for the Soviets to be reading this work and not actually rip it up and take it away is a complete and utter wonderment. And it makes it a classic of the genre. I believe that only one word, indeed, had to be taken out of the whole book, and it was Stalin. But I shall leave Laima also to tell a little story about that and how important that was. Kukutis himself is the joker. He's the simpleton. He's the innocent voice that came from a backward and rural community. But then with the intellectual sophistication of Martinitis that defied and completely evaded the wit of the authorities, it personified the people of Lithuania. Laima, I'd like to ask you a question in the first instance. Just very briefly, could you put the work into its historical and social context?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to go back to what you were saying a few words about Martinitis' memoir about his early childhood, called We Lived, Mes gyvenome in Lithuanian. And for him to be able to write about those events of his early childhood was extremely emotionally difficult. It took him his entire life to be able to come round to write about the trauma of living through war as a very young child. He was born in 1936. By 1940, he describes in his memoir, the first Soviet troops passed through, and then the Germans came in, the Nazis came in. He, as a very young child, witnessed the murder of the Jewish population of his village. He was in a cart. His father had just bought their vegetables to be sold in the market. They were coming back with their horse-drawn wagon, and a German soldier ordered them to stop in the road, and actually just wouldn't let them pass. And they saw a large group of people beside a sand pit, and they were gunned down. And so if you can imagine this very young child to have this horrific scene played out in front of you. Then came the Soviets, deportations to Siberia. Most of the people he knew were deported to the hard labor camps in Siberia. So again, most of the community, again, he sees this large population of his village disappears. The result was he didn't learn how to read or write until he was almost 10 years old, because he was almost rendered mute by these experiences. And he speaks about how in his early childhood he would spend a lot of time just listening to the stories of people who were, by Soviet society, they were deemed vagrants. They were people who just dropped out of society altogether. They either had gone mad or they pretended that they had gone mad. And they lived outside the realm of all the many detailed Soviet communist regulations that were imposed on regular working people. And he became, his lifelong fascination has been with these people who fall out of the context of culture and society. And this was really, these were the ideas that gave birth to the Kukutis character. He's a trickster. He is, he's someone who lives outside of the realms of rules and regulations. He passes the borderline between life and death, passes back and forth frequently. And the joke of the book is that the setting is a small farming community in Lithuania during the Stalin period called Žuveliškė, which means the village of the little fish, which is it's like a nonsense name. And Stalinization is taking place, lots of rules are being imposed on people who had an archaic agrarian lifestyle, that they have just lived this same lifestyle for centuries. And Kukutis is just, he either completely frustrates the authorities by being obtuse and unable to follow the rules, or he sneaks around the rules. And that's really the joke of the book. And the mention of Stalin is that the way censorship would work at the time, the poems were written in 1977. So the poems, the manuscript would be given to the publisher. The editor in the publishing house read through the manuscript to see if there was anything anti-Soviet, anything that could, engender any kind of freedom of thought or freedom of speech. And in the case of these poems, Martinaitis told me his editor was onto what he was doing. And he made one comment. He said, there was one mention of Stalin. He said, take it out, because the censors are going to zero in on that right away. And also because as a work of literature, it will ground the book in this specific historical time period. And all these years later, 30 plus years later, the poet himself is grateful to this editor for making that suggestion, because what he has found over the years, and what I have found as translator of these poems, is that the poems apply to any regime, any dictatorship. Really, a lot of the sentiment and the thought that's played out in the poems, we see that right now unfolding as we watch television coverage of what's going on in the Middle East.
Now, thank you. Very briefly, before we get to the actual poems, could you now come forward to 1977 and into the 80s and tell us what the power of the Kutis meant to not only Martinaitis but to the people of Lithuania? Why did it take off so remarkably into the psyche of the Lithuanian people?
Well, because I think when you hear the poems, you'll see that it's really easy to catch that the poems are ironic, they're tongue-in-cheek, that they're full of metaphor, and that they really are written in defiance of a totalitarian system. And because they're so playful, the language is very playful, they're really very funny, they just became popular. They roll off your tongue. The poems were set to music by one of Lithuania's most famous singer-songwriters, performed in theater groups, and they were chanted at mass rallies. If I may, read a very short excerpt. This is my memoir of being a student during the time of the singing revolution in the late 80s. At the time, this is the time when Martinaitis was my literature professor, and I was interested in his poetry, and that was when I began translating the poems. And this is just a description of one of the mass rallies where he is invited up on stage to read. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just a few excerpts. Our folk singing group was finished. We took our places at the back of the platform, serving as a stage in the cathedral square. Poets, performers, and speakers would climb up onto the stage, recite a poem, sing a song, say a few words, and then take a few steps to the back of the stage where the crowd was growing bigger and bigger. Every once in a while, someone would lift the toddler onto the stage, and whoever was closest to the microphone would say, "Attention, we have a lost child here." I looked out from the stage at the immense crowd. They looked like grassland shifting ever so slightly in the wind. Every person was holding a candle. Lights flickered across the cathedral square, along the winding side streets leading into the square, and along the other side of the river where processions of people were still making their way towards the square. It was impossible to estimate how many people had gathered for the candlelight vigil. Perhaps 20,000. Every generation was present, from swaddled infants to elderly men and women dressed in black cloth coats and felt boots. People were packed so tightly together that if any one person stumbled, they'd all come down like dominoes. Martinitis walked up to the microphone and pushed his tousled gray hair away from his thick glasses. The crowd began to chant, Liatova, Liatova. The poet grinned and lifted his hand slightly, and the crowd went silent. He spoke into the microphone. And for you, spring, isn't it spring? Isn't it beautiful, spring? When it's spring, when it's beautiful. How beautiful it is. How beautiful, even for the not beautiful, it's beautiful. When it's spring, when the sun thaws in the window panes. How beautiful it is to be grass or smoke over your homeland. Even for the dead, it's beautiful on earth. How beautiful it is for you, spring, when it's spring, when all of Lithuania returns with plows and hoes after a long winter's exile. And I thought to myself, this is how revolution begins, with candles, with songs, but mostly with poetry. And here's a photograph of what I don't know if you can see, but how, from that day, how big was the crowd, how many people.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting that poetry obviously took rather a centre position.
Yes, yeah.
And it was very important, I would hazard a guess, it was very important to that particular time, but also to the Lithuanian language itself.
Well,
am I correct in
yeah,
that?
but what I wanted to say, you said poetry took a very important position, but you have to understand that it wasn't just, you know, like here's a poet giving one mega huge poetry reading. The poets were actually the driving force behind the independence movement. They were masterminding the event. They were writing the legal documents. They were analyzing the Soviet constitution and thinking about loopholes and how they could really take apart the system from within. They really became, for a period of about 5 years, they became the revolutionaries, and so they had that dual role. They're really, you know, they're leading a passive, an organized passive resistance against the Soviet government, but then they're also connecting with the masses as a poet. So they're taking this dual role. And by about 1992, when independence had been established, then many of these poets, they stepped aside and let professional politicians step in and take over.
Well, yes, I wonder if that would ever happen again. Just wondering about England. Before that day, I think I think we should start with a poem, and I'd like it read, please, by Daiva in Lithuanian, and then by Laima in English.
So you want to start from the
Yes,
beginning,
please. Yes.
So come on.
The poem is called Experiment. Eksperimentas. Ko jis nedarė su savimi, kad būtų toks, koks savaime yra. Nesistengdamas būti toks, koks savaime yra. Ir ko jis nedarė, ėmė dainuoti chore, prisipirko kaklariščių, tepalo batams, veidrodį iki juosmens, bandė grožėtis peizažais, mylėti laukinius žvėrelius. Visą tai veltui galvojo, juk neįmanoma pasidaryti tokiam, koks esi savaime. Ir kada stengiasi būti toks, koks savaime esi, tada ne savaime esi toks, koks jau savaime esi. Ir ko jis nedarė, kad tik pasidarytų toks, koks savaime yra. Tada jis būdavo savaime toks, koks ne savaime yra. Ir jis pagalvojo, Dieve, jeigu tai mato kas nors, kokia tai gėda, galvojo, kol nevėlu, reikia bėgti. Ir pasileido jis bėgti, suprasdamas, kad ne savaime jis bėga, ne taip lyg bėgtų pats savo, ne taip, kaip bėga nesistengdamas, kad bėgtų taip, kaip bėga nesistengdamas, kaip iš tikrųjų bėga. Ir kiek jis stengiasi nesistengti, vis tiek tai buvo stengimasis stengtis, kad nesistengtų. Yeah, it's very funny. I can't imagine how to translate it.
I actually had a lot of fun translating this poem. It's called An Experiment.
What didn't he do so that he would be what he already was without trying to be what he already was? What didn't he try? He sang in a choir, bought several ties, shoe polish, a full-length mirror, joined the Wildlife Society. All in vain, he thought. After all, it's impossible to become what you already are. When you try to be what you already are, then you are not already what you already are. What didn't he try that he might become what he already was, so he would already be what he already wasn't? And he thought, Lord, what if someone saw me? How embarrassing, he thought. Well, it's not too late, I must run. And he broke into a run, knowing that he wasn't running by himself in the way he would run for himself, in the way he would run without trying to run, as if he were running without trying, as one really runs. However much he tried not to try, it was still trying to try not to try. How ridiculous, he thought. How ridiculous this whole thing is. It would seem that someone is trying to mislead me, so I'd become even more confused. But it's impossible to run that so you don't run, and still you must run so that it doesn't look as if running you're trying not to run, because it might just be that a higher force is watching. If you were to stop, he thought, then again you wouldn't be stopping by yourself, wanting to be what you already are, not running, and therefore you must run to run away somehow from this silly running. And he runs, with feathers from his pillow clinging to him, with eyes that don't see. He runs to be first and is chased by the bodiless forces of several worlds. I wanted to read another poem. This is a comment on the constraints of censorship that go so far as to even like a totalitarian regime tries even to control the alphabet. And it's called Cocutus's Appeal to the Alphabet. All letters are equal, starting with A. A blocks our way, exile A to the end. Let Z be written the same time as all the other letters. It's against the law to write A in front of Z. It's against the law to write Z in front of A. All letters have equal rights. All letters have equal chances of getting into the same word. All letters must be written and pronounced at the same time. All capital letters must be abolished. All lowercase letters are to become uppercase.
I just like to comment on that. They do sound hilariously funny, and somehow they sort of got this ring of Donald Rumsfeld, haven't they? Except one was trying to usurp the status quo, and the other one was trying to sustain it. Anyway, I think, Laima, you would like now to pass on to another book.
Yeah, the KB book.
That also illustrates